everyone. Welcome back to Souls Wide Open. I am Justin Larson, and I'm here with Chelan Harkin again. It is actually our episode 3, and we are talking about anger today. And we've got so much juicy content. I know this is actually one that we've already in the first, I think, 2 episodes already talked about. Getting to talk more about is this concept of anger and what really anger is all about, because it's one of our most shamed and forbidden emotions, but it's such an important one to actually understand. So hopefully today we can kind of crack anger open so that we can experience it in a loving and actually process of growth, I guess, in a way of growing. So yeah. Anything you want to say to start off, Chelan? Or I mean, I've got plenty to dive into.
Wonderful. Let's get going.
Okay, cool. So let's start out by talking about anger as a capping emotion, because I think that really will help us just like set the stage and define anger. We have experienced how anger is really just this top layer to other things, but it's this really powerful tool in that top layer that we get to use to basically avoid feeling other things. So at times it can be used to control others. It can be used to ignore other uncomfortable feelings. It feels powerful, so it feels like you've got authority and control. And yet it's really just covering up other things. Yeah, what do you got to say about that?
I just think that's such an important thing to be to understand. And that, yeah, I guess, and we can talk, I'm sure this will unfold more, but if we just react or project that anger or stay on that level, as so many of us do with the tool of like blaming people, and we can kind of stay locked, there's just so many layers of self that we miss, and so much self-understanding. And to understand ourselves is to be able to connect with ourselves and relax into ourselves, and to the degree we can understand ourselves, we can understand and connect with others. And so getting attached in the anger trap and not being willing to sink down can be such a limitation. And it can, and what you just shared, it's an invitation into just much deeper self-exploration.
Yeah, that's perfect. And you just used that word projection earlier. And I think it's important to take a second to kind of explain that, because in anger, that's such an important distinction to make. Anger, when projected at other people, is just like you're saying, it's not that taking responsibility, and it's actually blaming and putting someone else at fault for what you're feeling, right? So you're actually getting angry at them and projecting that anger at them, making it their fault, blaming them, versus the opposite type of anger, which is the loving type of anger to be in, which is the truthful expression of anger, which is us just letting that anger wash over us, go through, move, and just feel the frustration, which, like you said, is where the truth of what's going on inside of us actually exists. And when we don't understand the difference of these two things, we get stuck in that, like, well, anger is always bad. Like, I'm not an angry person. I don't want to project anger. I don't want to do the angry thing. But we have to understand that anger is also just a human emotion. And when expressed with self-responsibility and a willingness to be truthful about what's going on with yourself and not project it, then it's actually a really loving way to get deeper into what's actually going on with you and just understand what's beneath that top layer of frustration, annoyance, anger, all that stuff.
And so in the expression of those different things, I just want to do some clarifying here. Like, if we were to express projectile anger, it could be like more like you, like using like you statements and just things like that, right? And like labeling or making a whole story about what the other person did. And in the expression of the other anger, it could be like, I'm so frustrated. I feel so angry and helpless. I don't know what to do about this. I'm overwhelmed, like that kind of thing. Is that how you would kind of
yeah. And it's like the difference of thinking of someone while you're sitting there like fuming and like, oh, I can't believe they would do that, versus I'm so frustrated at what's happening to me. I'm so frustrated that I'm not being heard.
Yes.
I'm so frustrated.
Yes.
So it's like, we're not blaming the person or even the event or whatever, but like, why am I angry? Oh, because this is happening. And then what's so cool about that is that when you're actually connecting to what's really pissing you off, like not putting it on someone else, but like what's actually going on in here, then that second or even third layer will open up, which is usually like a fear or a sadness. Because when you think like, oh, they're not listening to me, that's actually usually pretty sad too. So like there's actually like a discomfort underneath the anger that we're avoiding. So sometimes we might end up having a really good cry when we sit in our anger that's truthful long enough, or like or just being really honest. It'll just flow into actually the thing that we really don't want to feel, which is like the sadness of not being heard.
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah.
Well, and then beneath that, even farther, is usually like a need or a desire. Like I so want to be heard. I so want to be loved. I so want to be seen. I so want to be appreciated and valued. I so want women to be respected. I so all these things. And so then so that's why and then when we're tracking that all the way down to that place, right? Like then we have two choices. When we see that need that hasn't been being met, then like either we can continue to just blame people, but that's kind of hard once you've like really connected with it, what's at the bottom of it. But I think that really helps with creative agency in our lives. Like, oh, wow, okay, I just really want something. So what can I do to try to see if it can happen?
Okay, this is so cool. And you're talking about the difference too, about like making it someone else's problem, which is that expectation of like, oh, this is unfair. You made this unfair, which is the angry expectation. And you're always going to get hurt when you're like coming from that place of expectation. You're always going to end up being angry. It's that demanding place versus the like, ooh, okay, I don't need to demand this of others. I need to take responsibility, feel the sadness that others maybe aren't showing up. But yeah, then also maybe take action into my own life to create what it is that I need or be more loving.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, wait. So that reminds me though, I think it was our first, or I don't know, maybe it was our second. No, I think it was our first episode. You talked about how owning your anger helped you get into the creative process so much more.
Yeah.
So maybe like, let's segue into that, because I know that'll be a really fascinating thing to hear.
Sure. Yes. So for me with anger, I have had a lot of anger, and I've projected my anger a lot, is the truth. And most only though, really for the most part, at people I'm closest with, my mom or my husband. And then I've had this, or people who like very clearly cross a line, then I justify the outbursts. But then for the most part, I've had this binary of like that happening with people I'm closest with, and then with other people, I'm just like, I repress all that energy, and then have just been kind of nice, overly nice, and kind of disempowered in relationship. So it's been a long journey there. So through your support, really identifying the power of taking responsibility of this. Basically, it started out as an experiment of like, oh, how will my life change when I try to take more responsibility for feeling my anger and exploring what's under there, rather than just immediately blaming my husband. And because there were reasons that I thought I could really easily justify for blaming my husband, as I think many of us really find ways to justify our anger. And sometimes, lots of other people would justify that too. And so we think I'm in the right for just blaming them. as that was how I had set it up. And so I had all of this incredible pain underneath my anger toward my husband, of like just being so scared of not being seen, not being connected with, not being loved, not being valued or heard. And so when I sat with that, it brought me into an incredible place of grief, like you said, of deep sadness, and needing to move through that and basically cry through that. And then at the bottom was when we go through that process, we clear out these channels into ourselves, and there's just so much more that we can understand and realize. And when we like clear that out, we also discover all of these desires and beautiful gifts and strengths that have been buried amidst all of that other repressed energy. And so that was a huge part. It was like this treasure hunt. And I had to move away all this dirt and such. And then I also discovered all of these jewels of these things that were missing in my life that were leading me to feel so helpless and dissatisfied. And in my process of wanting to be seen, I realized all the ways I was repressing my truth and my voice. And poetry, publishing my poetry, was such a symbol of bringing my truth and my voice forward. And so it just became clear eventually that that's what I had to do. And that was such a powerful healing. I felt like so much less of a victim and so much more of a creative agent in my life with this process. And it changed everything for me.
I love that. So it's like really how this anger, first off, becoming aware of it, even like, oh, okay, this is me projecting it at this person, or this is me completely avoiding it, even though I'm very frustrated or annoyed, which are really just like the baby layers of anger. They're still kind of the same flavor.
Yeah.
So either you were doing the like, oh, I'm frustrated and annoyed with this person, but I want to just like keep a really pretty facade and look nice to this individual. So it sounds like first there was like the awareness, then there was the ownership of it, and then underneath that you found all this actual inner truth and these gems, because you're willing to like experience yourself fully and not just kind of keep like layering or like avoiding and blaming. It's like, okay, here's the emotion. It sucks. It's painful. It's uncomfortable. But then like, oh, now I'm sitting here like willing to feel my truth about other things.
Yes. And then thank you for like breaking that down. And then also just to like clarify and underline, like this process of self-accountability can be so hard, like emotionally, just really there's a lot. Once we come out of denial about the ways we've been blaming other people, it's like, whoa, it's actually really easy to have compassion for ourselves about why we've been in denial and blaming, because there's so much there and it can be really overwhelming. So I just also want to underline that, but there are so many gifts in that process. And, if we just stop at the overwhelm, we don't necessarily get to connect with those, but it's everything in my life that is beautiful has come from this process.
Well, and people have a hard time, because like I obviously talk to my clients about this, and they kind of have a hard time sometimes believing me when I'm like, listen, getting truthful and feeling all this discomfort and like working through the stuff you're avoiding is what's going to crack you open to what's like really in your soul. Like it'll allow you to finally sit into yourself and be willing to feel what's uncomfortable and own it. And with that, all these other parts open up, and people are like, what? Like, why do I have to feel angry to do that? And I'm like, well, and then of course there's that discussion of how to feel loving anger, which is the ownership, but still there's this like massive disbelief that circulates in our world about the importance of feeling an emotion versus the ability to just like bypass it with like kind of that positive toxicity, toxic positivity, whatever people say. Like, I love that because it's so true. Like, we really need to be willing to feel what's going on and own this stuff. And then we open up to what's underneath it versus just using our minds or telling ourselves that we aren't an angry person when it's like, I don't know about that.
Yes. And there's always, right? Like, to the degree we repress any part of ourselves, like that requires a lot of life force to keep these energies down and hidden.
Oh,
And God, it's exhausting. For one, it requires this whole performance in our lives to like keep these things down. And it can eat up so much of our life force, this self-filtering. And like for years, I operated in that way. And I still do, but I keep returning to like, oh, okay, I need to take care of this now. But for a while, I was all repression all the time. And it was so miserable. And I think because anger is a capping emotion, it sort of feels like it's the thing on top. So if we repress that, we will repress so much beneath it. And then don't feel connected to ourselves or to God or to life or to our passions or to whatever. And it's just it's everything to be in a process of opening all of this up.
yeah. And
Yeah.
reframing it so that opening up is a loving act for yourself and even those around you, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh man, it's hard to imagine walking around with that like just constant suppression all the time now that like I've cracked myself open a little bit, because it's just exhausting. It's this heavy weight. It's this constant filtration of yourself. Like you're constantly
Yeah.
trying to like put on a pretty face when it's just that's not really what's there, versus the loving expression of like what's really going on, even in anger, which is of course, like we said, not projected at people, but like owned and felt within and moved through. Like then you're showing up for everyone around you in a far more loving and truthful way. You're not blaming them. They can feel the lift off of you, because you're not like even quietly walking around like blaming them. I mean, people,
Yes.
I think this is also really important, because I touched on it a second ago, but let's just like really define anger as like anything from being slightly annoyed with someone to being frustrated to full on rage, because a lot of people will not let themselves see that just even being annoyed when like someone leaves the dishes, like that's still anger. There's still a part of you that feels hurt. There's a hurt there, like, gosh, this person doesn't respect my space, or like whatever. But we were like, well, I'm just annoyed with them. And it's like, no, there's some stuff you need to look at there. Like what's actually happening inside of you? What's making you feel sad, which can feel like cracking up in a huge like amount of stuff to work through. But like when you start settling into it with truth and a willingness to feel it, it actually can just flow so easily. We just kind of have to get in the practice of it. So yeah.
100%. And I just am thinking about my experiences, like of having other people project on me and make me like bad or wrong in some way, to some degree, because of their anger. And the flip side, which is really equally as bad or as uncomfortable to be around, is like when people have felt anger toward me and have not expressed it and have just held it, and they're like, because they are actually expressing it, just not verbally. So it's like living in resentment soup energetically, just like it's just everywhere. And it's so awful. But then on the flip side, and this hasn't happened very much because it's not common and not many people have the capacity yet. We all have the capacity and potential, but to just share it like in this other way that's so loving, where it's like, Chelan, gosh, when you did that, I just felt so much anger. And then like they've done the self exploration to understand more about where that's come from, and because they have familiarized themselves with their anger and what's beneath it enough to be able to track that in and take care of it all. And it's been like the most intimate and beautiful and trust affirming and connective experience of my life. And like the 2 times people have done that with me.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
When I first started trying to own my anger, it was pretty messy. It was actually really messy.
Oh,
I remember a few times
that's good to say.
Yeah, because like you don't know the difference between projecting and owning. Like it's just so frustrating. There's so much heat there. And so I remember a few times like getting angry and just kind of like, almost like yelling and knowing I needed to do that, but like the person next to me still didn't have, like, I still wasn't clear enough with myself and with them, like, oh yeah, I'm just feeling anger, and like, and this is my partner, and so he's like, been like, oh my gosh, like, what are you? And I'm like, I'm just trying to feel my anger, and I know it's messy, but I need to just be truthful about it, and I'm trying to like own it. And
Yeah.
now it's at a point where like, and we're at this really interesting situation, or I know, point in our evolution where we're, as I've said, living separately, working on becoming more whole individuals so that when we're together, it can be a more loving situation. There's just some stuff that we both need to work out individually. And that recently has just been bringing up tons of grief, obviously, like just tons of stuff that I just like really need to go through, just being alone a lot and feeling unloved, even though that's not necessarily like all the projections I'm getting, but it's still like arising. So just like going through tons of grief. And now
Yeah.
I have this awareness of, oh my gosh, if I suppress this, I would be so angry at him. Like,
Yes.
I
Wow.
would just be so angry. And so I don't want to be angry. And I'm so aware of like, actually, I'm just so sad about things that, by the way, like a lot of that, as we've talked about, like this stuff is from childhood. Like I know it's not caused by him. It's certainly things that happen in a relationship reveal it to me, but like I'm
Yeah.
owning all of this so that it's not part of our relationship. Well, to the best of my ability, it's so messy at times. But what I really want to just express is like, at the beginning of this process, it was messy and I was totally still projecting when I was trying not to. And now I'm at a point where like, oh my gosh, if I don't feel these underlying things, I will just get angry, and I can see that. And I don't want to be angry. I don't want to project. So now I'm like, oh, I just need to feel the deep emotions. And it's so much easier for me to go there, which has been really fascinating, but also a painful place to go sit in those heavy emotions too. Yeah.
Word. Yes.
Yeah.
And I want to say, gosh, well, I want to talk a little bit about the things that have kept me, like just some personal things that in relationship have made it really hard for me to share anger with another person. Like for one thing, there's been a real belief that I'll hurt someone, real fear of hurting someone. And not just fear of hurting them, but that then they won't be able to steward that properly and they're hurt. And that will, because of that, it'll just absolutely destroy the relationship. Like if I do anything to hurt someone else, because in my family of origin, there was some development yet to do about like taking care of hurt feelings that people hadn't really learned how to do that very well. And so if feelings were hurt, it would always create an obstacle between us. And that was really sad for me. So I carried that forward, like really, really sad. And so, and then there's also been this pressure of like my worth has to do with just being a source of light for people. And that's a big one. And so then there, like, anyway, so it's been a lot. It's been a long journey that I'm still on, like experimenting with moving toward wholeness. And then always, like you said, there's just these layers of sadness beneath that, like wanting to be deeply loved and accepted in a really solid way in all moods, and times when I didn't feel I could have that in childhood. And it's this incredibly beautiful tending to our inner children, really, when we can go and take care of that grief that we weren't supported in taking care of and moving through when we were kids. And so all this got kind of stuck or lodged in our system. And so it's a really transformational process, wouldn't you say, when we can get to that deeper level of where the causal stuff and work through that. And it really kind of changes our whole experience of life.
Whole experience. And the relationship part of that is so important. At the very beginning, you said that you felt like you might be hurting others. And I was actually just looking over here. Our next, well, we actually have a bonus episode after this, but the one after that is we're going to talk about relational fragility, because really that is this topic of like, sure, in anger, when it's projecting, we are damaging other people. We are hurting when we're in that projecting, blaming. We're not just hurting the other person, but we're hurting ourselves too. Versus the ownership of your emotions and allowing other people to own their emotions, which is painful, but a loving interaction and way of going through. So we'll get into that more in the next one, because that's such a huge thing to wrap your brain around. But nonetheless, an important topic when we're discussing anger, because the ownership can bring up so much, versus this kind of like, we're almost more comfortable and it feels more normal to blame other people for what's going on with you. And that anger is actually like something that, it's amazing how we've made that more normal, being like projecting and blaming other people versus just like fully experiencing what we're feeling.
I think you touched on something so important there. Yeah, it's pretty status quo. It's pretty commonplace to blame or to talk in a way that's mean about other people, or to in some ways offload, whereas it can be pretty revolutionary to own our feelings, and it can be, people aren't used to that. And it's disruptive of pattern, because it's disruptive of patterns. In the name, it's an incredibly loving disruption, but it's disruptive of old paradigms. And and I want to just say briefly that as a parent, it's been interesting to explore the conditioning I've received that's pretty, I think, also quite commonplace, that it's okay as a parent. There is like a normalizing in parenting of like, it's okay to be sort of angry and authoritarian and controlling. Like there's like permission for parents to act that way. But then to say things like, gosh, honey, to your child, like, I don't know what to do right now with this. I don't know how to handle this. I feel really helpless and out of control and inadequate. Interesting. Or like, I have a lot of baggage around like not feeling respected coming up that I need to take care of. Like, how often do we hear parents talk like that? Like, but that's what's going on underneath the anger so often for parents. And so it's just really interesting what you said about how, normalized in some ways those kinds of offloading patterns are, and the others are more revolutionary, but they're so important in moving toward a track of relational health.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I can't wait to talk more about this, especially when it comes to children and the relational fragility stuff, because it's so true what they experience. Okay. But also on those lines, what something that's it's interesting too is how women and men kind of express anger differently. And this is, I'm speaking in terms of like the culture I was raised in, which is in the US. So, and kind of Western society in a lot of ways. So there may be other cultures where this is totally different, but for the most part, men are more allowed, or it's like a little more normal for them to be kind of like outwardly assertive, and we would say maybe aggressive. It's actually assertiveness and aggression is seen as a masculine trait, which isn't really all that true. It's just that like we've labeled them it's more okay for them to do that, even though like it's just kind of a loving thing. It's not masculine to be like aggressive. Like that's not the divine masculine stuff, right? But nonetheless, we've kind of given them the green light on that. We're like, women really can't be as aggressive, but they're allowed to usually be more go into grieving and sadness. Like it's usually okay for them to feel more grief in public, let's say, where men, grieving in public a little more, it's like a little less accepted, but like for them to be angry is like it's more accepted. It's fascinating how our roles have created these two different paradigms for like who can feel what and when.
That is interesting. Yeah. And the obstacles, like some of the conditioned obstacles in going into those deeper layers. Like, I mean, it's hard for everybody, I think, to encounter helplessness and deep sadness and stuff, but maybe there is more permission for, or maybe, who knows, maybe it can be harder for men to go there into those deeper layers. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, which is really just unfortunate because they're all human emotions. There's
Mhm.
there's no less or
Right.
more capacity for any of them for any human. We're
Yes.
all 100% equally they're 100% available to all of us and should be. Like we should all be feeling
Yeah.
all of these things.
So, right. So anger and aggression or whatever isn't more masculine, and grieving and sadness or helplessness isn't more feminine.
No,
And
not at all.
yeah, and that's an important point you made. They're all human emotions. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing out of the normal about having any of these energies. These emotions are simply energies with with certain kind of frequency of charge or whatever, but they're actually completely neutral. These energies, it's just how we respond to them.
Yeah.
But there's nothing masculine or feminine or even unhealthy about any of it. It's just energies that move through us that we need to learn how to steward.
Yeah, and they're there as information. Like, and I love that emotions are energy in motion. So we're sensing an energy and it's giving us information about what's going on. So like when we're angry, we feel this energy and it's like, okay, wait, why am I angry? Oh, because this person's not listening to me. Oh, that's sad. Oh, it hurts when someone doesn't listen to me. This is information about what it means to be unloving or be not loved. So like not holding space for someone. Oh, that feels crappy to me. I should also probably make sure that I'm not like ignoring other people too. Like it's just also that we can learn and understand literally how to become more loving people. It's just information to guide us towards like what it would look like to have good feelings versus bad. And if we can't like take in that information and then like learn from it, then we're just going to be perpetually in the negative because we're not willing to like absorb, think about, and then like, oh, that felt crappy. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to go do the loving thing, you know?
Totally. And just one more comment from me is like that I've so learned largely from your example is that whenever there's anger, yeah, of course, understanding and really with the intention of looking at how that played out in my childhood, just almost always trying to go to the childhood space. And that doesn't ever justify what's happening in the present moment. It doesn't make it okay. But that if I can take care of that deeper level charge, I can return to what's happening in the present with so much more maturity rather than reactivity about the pain from the past. And because I mean, the same thing could happen to two different people, one who has a wound that it mimics from their childhood and one who doesn't. And they'll respond to that same thing in completely different ways.
Yeah.
Right. And so there is a way to really tend to those roots and then to be able to face the present with just a lot more just groundedness. And we can still address it, but we're not losing our minds about it. We're grounded and we're okay as we like come toward that.
Yeah. So I think the lesson for today, if I was to sum it up, is like when you take ownership of your anger, you're opening yourself up, to deeper emotions that are there, but also to the truth of yourself. And you become more loving in that process to yourself and others. So anger is this entryway into like a more loving life and all of these gems, as you put it, to our soul, because we're willing to experience ourselves in such an open and truthful way. So
beautiful. And anger isn't necessarily contrary to interpersonal relationship. It can be a beautiful entry point to like incredible intimate understanding and connection.
Right.
If it's taken care of. Yeah. Well, and tell us a little bit more what's coming next, Justin, with this podcast.
Sure. So we decided at the very beginning of all this to do 6 episodes, but then it hit me that we actually have recorded a really cool conversation before all of this. I actually spend maybe a half hour or so asking Chelan a lot about engaging in the coaching practice, meaning like I was her coach through a lot of her work in writing her book and all that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to ask her about her experience, like what it's like being coached by me and also like going through the process. And so we have this great, pretty fun conversation. And I thought, heck, let's make that a bonus episode. So that's actually episode 4, which is really interesting. I think you guys will all really enjoy it. And then we will still have 3 more after this, which I have pulled up. Those ones are going to be the relational fragility. So really moving beyond people pleasing and the fear of conflict, embracing a holistic spiritual pathway, and then pursuing our big dreams, which I'm really excited about that one too. So yeah, so that is all still to come. And I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, me too. I'm so excited. I love the themes we've come up with for this podcast. And one more important announcement is just that Justin and I realized that we crack open a lot of really, really big concepts here in this podcast that might be like kind of new explorations for people, and they might leave you with lots of further questions. And we want to have spaces, right, Justin, where those questions we can address them together.
Yeah.
So we'll be doing we're planning to do a Zoom event where people who are interested can come and we can have something of a Q&A about anything that's left over after listening to these podcasts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're looking at kind of early summerish, something in there. We'll let you all know when we have a date picked out for that. But yeah, like a live Q&A. Yep, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Mwah, thank you.
Mwah! Love you. Talk to you soon.
Bye. Love you. Bye.